In September of 2022, Hurricane Ian made landfall in southwestern Florida as a Category 4 hurricane. It produced catastrophic storm surge, damaging winds, and historic freshwater flooding across much of central and northern Florida. Ian was responsible for over 150 direct and indirect deaths and over $112 billion in damage, making it the costliest hurricane in Florida's history and the third costliest in United States history. Ian also made landfall as a Category 3 hurricane in western Cuba, bringing widespread damage and loss of power to the entire island. Ian made its final landfall as a Category 1 hurricane in South Carolina. It all began on September 14th as a tropical wave off the coast of Africa, and it became one of the strongest hurricanes to impact the United States, and a major hurricane at that. It peaked at Category 5 strength beginning on September 3rd, ending on September 30th, and finally dissipating on October 1st. Like I mentioned, off the coast of Africa is where the storm formed on September 14th. A week later, it made it to the Windward Islands. The day after that, the wind shear to its north from Hurricane Fiona limited further development of the system. And on September 23rd, Tropical Depression 9 formed 130 miles east-northeast of the island of Aruba. Before that formation, the National Hurricane Center predicted a low chance of formation 84 hours in advance. 72 hours in advance, they predicted a medium chance of formation. And 63 hours in advance, they predicted a high chance of formation. Of all of the outlooks issued by the National Hurricane Center, 100% of them had the genesis location, and of the high outlooks, it's in the center. As we can see in Section A, all 16 of tropical weather outlooks forecasted, all of them intersect where the formation happens. That's where that star is. The low chance of formation also happened correctly, medium correctly, and high also correctly. The same day, on September 23rd, Tropical Depression 9 began to move west-northwest due to a ridge located to its north. The next day, it becomes Tropical Storm Ian, 335 miles southeast of Jamaica, still impacted by wind shear. Ian then begins to turn to the northwest and rapidly intensify, in a period of rapid intensification that lasts a very long time as it moves on the southwest side of the ridge. Because of the rapid intensification, on September 26th, Ian becomes a Category 1 hurricane with winds of 100 miles away from 100 miles south-southwest of Grand Cayman Island, and it continues to rapidly intensify over those waters that are 30 degrees Celsius or greater. As a result, on September 27th, Ian becomes a major hurricane that is a Category 3 just before landfall near La Coloma in Cuba at 8:30 at 110 knots. That's 125 miles an hour, and the minimum pressure was 947 millibars. In Cuba, there were 5 indirect deaths due to the landfall. Flooding overall, the highest in Cuba was 335 millimeters, which translates to 13.31 inches. The highest storm surge was 8 to 10 feet. The winds were 125 miles per hour, and there were no tornadoes. After that, on the same day again, on September 27th, Ian emerges over the Gulf of Mexico at 14Z, and an eyewall replacement cycle begins. Surprisingly, Ian strengthens after that eyewall replacement cycle and continues to strengthen more as it continues to approach Florida. Ian makes landfall in the Dry Tortugas at 2Z the next day at 110 knots, the same wind speed it was in Cuba, and continues to rapidly intensify into a 140-knot Category 5 hurricane. Right after that, Ian weakens slightly and makes landfall in Cayo Costa at 12:05Z, a 130-knot hurricane, and again near Punta Gorda at 20:35Z, as a 125 knot hurricane. The rainfall in Florida was 26.95 inches. The storm surge was measured to be between 10 and 15 feet. Winds were to 150 miles an hour, and there were 14 tornadoes over the state of Florida, with the largest tornado being an EF2. There were 66 direct deaths as well as 84 indirect deaths over the course of its landfall, and you can see the radar image of it making landfall near Punta Gorda on the screen. On September 28th, Ian continues to weaken as it moves over northeast Florida, and on September 29th, it weakens to a severe tropical storm of 60 knots as it enters the Atlantic near Cape Canaveral around midday, which is really the morning local time. It later became a hurricane again. It turns northward, making landfall in Georgetown, South Carolina on September 30th at 1805 Z at a 70-knot Category 1 hurricane. The next day, by 0Z, the Ian merged with a front, making it non-tropical, and the entire system dissipated by 12Z. The flooding in North South Carolina and Virginia was 10.75 inches. The storm surge was 4 to 6 feet. Winds were to 80 miles an hour, and there was one tornado in North Carolina. There were 6 indirect deaths, 5 of those in North Carolina and 1 in Virginia. Over the course of Ian's life, the maximum flooding was the 26.95 inches recorded in Grove City, Florida. Storm surge maxed out at 10 to 15 feet. The winds peaked at 160 miles per hour, and there were 15 tornadoes, with the maximum being an EF2. There were a total of 161 deaths. 13 people are still missing. There was $112.9 billion in damages, with Cuba not even reporting damage figures yet. Ian is the costliest hurricane in Florida history, with $109.5 billion from Florida alone. As we can see on these graphs here, Ian's first peak of strength occurred right before its Cuba landfall, and again right before its 2 landfalls in mainland Florida. It also briefly peaked, according to at least pressure, in the Dry Tortugas before that landfall, and then again right before landfall in South Carolina. The wind speed makes a similar argument. As you can see, the National Hurricane Center forecast tracks were generally to the north of the location. However, the landfall point was solidly within the cone at the time throughout the history of Ian. So every single cone contained the landfall point in it. As we can see by the intensity, it slightly over and underperformed the intensity at times, showing that these tropical cyclones are more volatile than we can currently predict. Storm surge peaked south of the landfall point with 10 to 15 feet, as we have mentioned. Storm surge warnings were in effect for much of the Gulf Coast of Florida, portions of the Atlantic coast of Florida, all of Georgia, all of South Carolina, and portions of North Carolina as well. In South Carolina, the largest storm surge was to the north of the landfall point, from 4 to 6 feet of storm surge. Perhaps the most notable change was in Sanibel Island, where the barrier island got absolutely devastated by storm surge. That can also be seen here at Fort Myers Beach, where well in advance, you can see at 3Z on September 26th, the storm surge watch was issued. At 21Z the same day, a storm surge warning was issued. 2 days after the first hint of a storm surge was made possible, that is, on September 28th, the onset of tropical storm force winds began. Landfall occurred later in the day on September 28th, and with that was the highest recorded storm surge, just over 12 feet. 12.7 feet, that is. We can also see by the rainfall map there were 2 major centers of rain, one just to the north of the landfall point, and one again to the north of Cape Canaveral as the storm continued. The secondary maximum was around 23 inches of rain. Over the course of this hurricane, there were plenty of power outages. Most notably was when it initially, around the time it initially made landfall, with 2.5 million people out of power. That continued again by the time of its second landfall near the South and North Carolina border, where still 2 million people remained without power, with several people in Florida being restored, but many still not having power, and North Carolina and South Carolina beginning to lose power. That's all for this special event summary on Hurricane Ian. I'm Chris Dixon, InfoWeather Media.